Good evening. I am Clara Nightwell. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara. Good evening, Clara.
Some names in history feel distant, almost ceremonial. They appear in textbooks and lecture halls and footnotes that seem older than the arguments themselves. Tonight, we are speaking about Plato.
A philosopher whose influence became institutional as much as intellectual.
He is often introduced as the foundation of Western philosophy. But I would like to begin with a narrower question. Was Plato building abstract theories about reality, or was he responding to a political world that felt unstable and dangerous?
To understand that, we must begin with Athens after war, defeat and internal fracture.
So the world that shaped him was not calm or contemplative.
No, it was marked by instability, political reversal, and the execution of his teacher.
Then perhaps we should begin not with his ideas, but with the crisis that made them necessary. Tonight, we begin with Plato's early years.
Plato was born around 427 before the Common Era, into an aristocratic family in Athens. His family traced its lineage to some of the old political elites of the city, people who viewed democratic rule with caution.
So he was not raised as a natural defender of democracy.
No, while Athens was formally democratic, his relatives were connected to oligarchic circles that favored restricted political participation. His youth coincided with the final stage of the Peloponnesian War, when Athens was weakened by prolonged conflict with Sparta. In 404 before the Common Era, Athens surrendered. Soon after, the 30 tyrants established an oligarchic regime.
That regime must have promised stability after defeat.
It promised order but delivered repression. It lasted less than a year before democracy was restored. Plato witnessed rapid transitions between systems of rule, each claiming legitimacy, each exposing structural weakness.
So instability was part of his formation.
Yes, political authority in Athens appeared fragile and reversible. During this period, Plato encountered Socrates, whose method emphasized questioning rather than asserting doctrines.
So philosophy entered his life during a time of civic uncertainty.
Exactly. And in 499 before the Common Era, Athens condemned Socrates to death. For Plato, that event demonstrated that democratic decision-making could eliminate a figure devoted to examination and dialogue.
So the question of who should govern became personal, not theoretical.
Yes. The problem of political authority would become central to his thought. After the execution of Socrates, Plato left Athens. The city was politically restored but intellectually altered. For a young aristocrat who had witnessed both oligarchic repression and democratic condemnation, participation in politics no longer appeared stable or trustworthy.
So he chose distance.
Yes. Plato began a period of travel that would last several years. He is said to have visited regions in southern Italy and Sicily, where Greek colonies had developed different political arrangements. In these areas, particularly in Magna Graecia, philosophical communities associated with Pythagorean thought emphasized mathematics, order, and harmony as structural principles of reality.
So philosophy there was systematic.
Very much so. Rather than focusing only on ethical inquiry, these groups treated number, proportion, and structure as foundational to understanding the world. This exposure appears to have influenced Plato's later emphasis on abstract forms and intelligible order beyond sensory experience. At the same time, Plato observed different models of rule, including the court of Dionysius I of Syracuse, a ruler who held power through concentration rather than participation.
A philosopher near a ruler.
Yes. Plato's interactions with the ruling court in Syracuse were complex and ultimately unsuccessful. He attempted to advise or influence governance through philosophical reasoning. The effort demonstrated a recurring tension in his life, whether philosophical insight could reshape political authority from within existing structures. His attempts did not produce reform. Instead, they revealed how resistant power could be to intellectual correction.
So experience reinforced skepticism.
Yes. Plato returned to Athens not as a political participant, but as a thinker seeking a more durable foundation for governance. Around 387 before the Common Era, he established what would become known as the Academy. This was not a school in the modern sense, but a community dedicated to sustained inquiry into mathematics, ethics, metaphysics, and political structure. For Plato, education became the alternative to unstable politics. If rulers could not be corrected after gaining power, perhaps they could be formed before holding it.
So reform shifted from the assembly to the classroom.
Exactly. Plato began articulating a vision in which philosophical training preceded authority. The problem of rule would not be solved by persuasion alone, but by structured formation. During this period, he composed dialogues that used Socrates as a central figure, not merely as tribute, but as a method of preserving inquiry while expanding its scope. The dialogues did not present doctrines in systematic treatise form. Instead, they staged conversations in which definitions were tested and refined. Through this literary strategy, Plato preserved the voice of his teacher, while gradually introducing more structured metaphysical claims.
So writing became construction.
Yes, the written dialogue allowed Plato to move beyond immediate politics and begin constructing an intellectual architecture capable of outlasting any single regime. By the middle of his life, Plato's thought began to crystallize around a more explicit structural claim. He argued that the instability he had witnessed in Athens was not merely political failure, but a failure of knowledge.
A failure of knowledge.
Yes. Plato concluded that most political actors were guided by opinion rather than understanding. Opinion shifts with emotion, persuasion, and circumstance. Knowledge, in his view, required access to stable principles that do not fluctuate with public mood. This distinction between opinion and knowledge became foundational to his theory of forms.
The famous forms.
Yes. Plato proposed that beyond the visible world exists an intelligible order of stable realities, which he called forms. Particular objects are imperfect instances, but the form represents what something truly is, independent of change or perception. For example, many acts may be called just, but justice itself as a form remains constant.
So politics becomes a question of access to what is truly just.
Exactly. If rulers govern by opinion, their decisions fluctuate. If they govern by knowledge of the good, their decisions align with stable principles. This argument culminates in what is now known as the Republic, a dialogue in which Plato constructs an ideal city as a model for examining justice. The city is divided into functional classes: producers, guardians, and rulers. Each performs a role aligned with capacity and training.
A rigid hierarchy.
A structured one. Plato did not describe it as oppression, but as alignment between nature and responsibility. At the apex stands the philosopher-ruler, someone who has undergone extensive education in mathematics, dialectic, and moral formation. Only after years of intellectual discipline would such a figure be permitted to govern.
So knowledge precedes authority.
Yes, for Plato, the tragedy of Athens was that authority preceded knowledge. The famous allegory of the cave illustrates this structure. Prisoners mistake shadows for reality. Only through intellectual ascent can one perceive what truly is. The philosopher who exits the cave gains knowledge, but upon returning may be rejected or misunderstood by those still confined to opinion.
An echo of Socrates.
Yes, the execution of Socrates is never far from this framework. Through these arguments, Plato was not merely describing metaphysics. He was constructing a justification for structured intellectual authority. The instability of Athens had led him to a radical conclusion. Political order requires epistemic order. If the Republic represents Plato's most ambitious theoretical construction, his later life reveals how difficult it was to translate that construction into practice. The idea that philosophers should rule did not remain confined to dialogue. Plato attempted, more than once, to test its plausibility in the political world.
He returned to Syracuse.
Yes. After the death of Dionysius I, Plato was invited to the court of Dionysius II, a younger ruler, who was said to be open to philosophical influence. Plato saw in this invitation the possibility of shaping a ruler through education, rather than argument alone. If a ruler could be trained in philosophy, perhaps the model of the philosopher-king could move from abstraction to reality.
So the classroom moved into the palace.
That was the hope. In practice, court politics proved resistant to transformation. Advisors competed for influence. Suspicion circulated. Philosophical instruction became entangled with factional struggle. Plato's association with Dion, a relative of the ruling family who favored reform, further complicated matters.
So philosophy entered power, Directly.
Yes, but without structural protection. The court was not designed for philosophical reform. Ultimately, the project failed. Dionysius did not become a philosopher-ruler. Political tensions intensified rather than stabilized. Plato left Syracuse, returned, and later attempted again, only to encounter similar resistance.
So the experiment did not confirm the theory.
It confirmed the difficulty of implementing it. Plato's later dialogue, The Laws, reflects a more restrained approach to political design. In the Laws, he no longer assumes that a perfectly educated ruler will govern. Instead, he outlines a second-best system in which legal structure constrains human weakness. The emphasis shifts from ideal insight to institutional regulation.
So realism enters his thought.
Yes, the later Plato appears more attentive to limitation. He recognizes that education alone cannot eliminate ambition, rivalry, or fear. The structural turning point in his life, therefore, is not only the creation of the Republic, but the encounter with its limits. Theory had met practice, and practice had imposed constraints.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret. Margaret, for those who want to understand Plato beyond summary, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most demanding one. I would suggest beginning with The Republic by Plato.
So not a modern interpretation.
No. The dialogue itself allows readers to see how Plato builds his arguments step by step, through conversation rather than proclamation.
Is it accessible to someone without philosophical training?
It requires patience, but it is structured as inquiry. The questions guide the reader forward.
So it reflects the method we explored tonight.
Exactly. To understand Plato's impact, it is best to encounter the discipline of his thinking directly.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
By the final decades of his life, Plato no longer presented philosophy as a dramatic solution to political crisis, but as a long institutional commitment. The Academy continued to function as a center of study, drawing students from across the Greek world. Among them was Aristotle, who would later challenge many of Plato's conclusions, while preserving his method of structured inquiry.
So influence began to outlive the founder.
Yes, Plato's lasting impact was not confined to a single doctrine, but embedded in an educational model that treated philosophy as disciplined formation. His later dialogues show increasing attention to structure, law, and procedural order, rather than visionary idealism. The Laws, in particular, abandons the expectation of a perfectly wise ruler, and instead designs a system in which institutions moderate human instability.
So the ambition narrows.
It becomes more restrained. Plato appears to accept that human societies require constraints as much as insight. He died around 347 before the Common Era, leaving behind not a political movement, but a sustained intellectual infrastructure. The Academy would continue for centuries, long after the city-states that shaped his concerns had been absorbed into larger empires.
So his city was not Athens, but the institution he built.
In a sense, yes. Plato's most durable political act was educational rather than legislative. The question we raised at the beginning was whether he was primarily a philosopher of abstract ideas or a political thinker responding to crisis. The record suggests that his metaphysics and his politics cannot be separated. The instability of Athens shaped his search for permanence.
So the forms were not an escape from history.
No, they were a response to it. Plato did not resolve the tension between knowledge and power. Instead, he reframed it as a permanent problem. His legacy endures not because he eliminated political instability, but because he insisted that authority without understanding is fragile.
Not a monument, but a question that continues.
Exactly. Plato's life suggests that the search for just rule requires intellectual discipline, institutional patience, and an acceptance of human limitation. After Plato's death, his thought did not remain confined to the Academy. Aristotle, his most prominent student, adopted the method of systematic inquiry, while rejecting key elements of the theory of forms. Through Aristotle, and later through Hellenistic schools, Roman intellectual culture, and medieval scholarship, Plato's questions traveled far beyond Athens. In late antiquity, Neoplatonic thinkers reinterpreted his metaphysics as a structured hierarchy of reality. Christian, Islamic, and Jewish philosophers engaged with his arguments, adapting them to theological frameworks while preserving his emphasis on intelligible order.
So the academy became a starting point, not an end point.
Yes, Plato's impact was cumulative. Renaissance humanists revisited his dialogues. Early modern political thinkers debated his conception of authority. Contemporary philosophy still responds to his distinctions between knowledge and opinion. Even modern discussions about expertise, education, and the role of intellectuals in public life echo his central concern.
So the question of who should rule remains unsettled.
Exactly. Plato did not provide a final solution. He provided a framework for examining the relationship between knowledge and power. His lasting influence lies not in a single doctrine, but in the insistence that political structures must answer to standards that transcend immediate opinion.
So his legacy is a discipline of thinking.
Yes, a discipline that continues to shape institutions, curricula, and debates across cultures.
Thank you for staying with us tonight, and thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through a life that turned instability into inquiry.
Thank you, Clara. Some questions endure because they are never fully resolved.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.